If she's having a child, it's mine." Jackson Reed hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. Every man, woman, and child standing in that street heard him perfectly. Clara Whitfield felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She didn't even know this man. Not really. Yet here he was, tall, still dangerous as the quiet before a storm, putting his entire name between her and the people who were ready to tear her apart. If you love stories about courage, loyalty, and love born in the hardest moments, subscribe to our channel right now. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Clara Whitfield had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because she had somewhere to be. Not because the boarding house needed tending, though it always did. She was awake because the feeling had returned, that low, creeping pressure in her chest that told her something was wrong, before her mind could find the words for it. She'd had that feeling before. The morning her father died. The evening her mother stopped breathing. Both times her body had known before anyone told her. And both times she had pushed the feeling aside, told herself she was being dramatic, told herself everything was fine. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. So she got up. She lit the lamp. She started the fire in the kitchen stove and began heating water for the morning's breakfast, because 12 boarders depended on her, and the world didn't stop for bad feelings, no matter how loud they got. Willow Creek, Montana, was already stirring outside her windows. Even before 6 in the morning, she could hear the distant clang of the blacksmith shop opening its doors, the low groan of wagon wheels on dry dirt, the muffled conversation of miners heading out before the sun was fully up. This town never really slept. It just grew quieter for a few hours, and then started up again like a machine that couldn't be turned off. Clara had lived in Willow Creek her entire life. 24 years. She knew every face, every family, every grudge and alliance and secret that the town carried in its pockets. She had watched children grow into adults, and adults grow into old men and women with grandchildren on their knees. She had buried her parents in the town cemetery and kept their boarding house running because it was the only thing she had left of them. She was not a woman who asked for much. She kept to herself. She worked hard. She helped when she could, charged fairly for the rooms and meals she provided, and never put herself in anyone's business unless they asked her to. That she had always believed was enough. That morning, she would discover she was wrong. The first knock came at 7:30. It was old Margaret Hines from the dry goods store, and the look on her face told Clara immediately that this was not a social visit. Margaret was a woman who prided herself on bluntness. She didn't ease into things or wrap her words in kindness she didn't feel. She looked at Clara with something that sat uncomfortably between pity and suspicion, and she said, "I think you need to know what's being said about you." Clara set down the coffee pot she was holding. "What's being said?" Margaret pressed her lips together. "People are talking, Clara, about you being in a family way, without a husband." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Clara counted them without meaning to. "Excuse me, I'm not saying I believe it," Margaret said quickly, which told Clara immediately that she half believed it. "But it's all over town already. The Caldwell girl was telling it at the post office this morning. By now it's spread halfway to the river." Clara felt something cold move through her. "That is not true," she said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. "I know that's what you say. That is not true," Clara repeated. "There is no child. There is no man. There is nothing. Vivian Caldwell is lying, and she is lying because her brother came to this house 2 weeks ago, and I asked him to leave. That is all this is." Margaret looked uncomfortable. Not because she doubted Clara exactly, but because uncomfortable truths were harder to act on than simple rumors. And Margaret Hines, for all her bluntness, was not a woman who liked to put herself in difficult positions. "Well," she said finally, "you might want to be careful today." She left without finishing her coffee. By 8 o'clock, Clara knew it was worse than Margaret had described. She could feel it the moment she stepped outside to hang the morning linens. The way eyes moved across her. the way conversations paused and then continued at a slightly lower register when she walked past. The way Mrs. Paulson from across the street pulled her daughter inside and shut the door without saying a word. Willow Creek had a specific temperature when it turned on someone. Clara had felt it aimed at others before the drifter, who'd been accused of stealing horses, the young widow, who'd remarried too quickly after her husband's death, the Chinese laborer who'd tried to open a restaurant on Main Street. That particular cold, that collective silent withdrawal of goodwill. She had never expected to feel it aimed at her. She went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and forced herself to breathe slowly. One of her boarders, a quiet schoolteacher named Mr. Abbott, came down for breakfast and didn't meet her eyes when she poured his coffee. That told her everything she needed to know about how far the story had already traveled. She should have stayed inside. She knew that later, after everything she understood, that staying inside, keeping her head down, waiting for the truth to surface on its own, would have been the smarter choice. Less dangerous, at least. Less explosive. But Clara Whitfield had never been the kind of woman who hid when she was innocent. So at 9 o'clock, she put on her good coat, pinned her hat, and walked out into Willow Creek's main street. The crowd had gathered near the general store. It wasn't an organized thing. It never was in a town like this. It was just people who happened to be nearby when a conversation started, and then more people who joined because something interesting was happening, and then more still until there were 30 or 40 residents standing in a loose cluster with the specific energy of people who had already made up their minds. Vivian Caldwell was at the center of it. She was 22 years old, beautiful in the hard, expensive way that came from having money in a poor town, and she was holding court the way she always did, with complete confidence in her own authority and zero interest in anyone else's perspective. Clara heard her own name before she was close enough to see faces. Always thought there was something off about her, living alone in that house, taking in all those men. They're boarders, someone said weakly. Men are men, Vivian replied. And a woman living alone with no family and no reputation to speak of. My reputation, Clara said loudly, is exactly what it has always been. The crowd parted. She walked through the gap they created and stopped 10 feet from Vivian Caldwell, and she looked her directly in the eyes, and she did not flinch. You are lying, Clara said. You are lying because your brother couldn't accept that I wasn't interested in him, and you are using me to punish him for his embarrassment. And everyone here knows it. Vivian's expression didn't change. That was the frightening thing. She had the smooth, practiced calm of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. No one's calling you a liar, Clara, she said, and her tone was almost gentle. We're just concerned. A woman your age alone, it's not unheard of to make mistakes. I have not made a mistake. There is nothing. This is a fabrication. Then why? Vivian said, tilting her head with a small smile. Have 3 separate women already told me they saw you sick outside the boarding house last Tuesday? Silence. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. She had been sick last Tuesday. A bad piece of pork from the market, she'd thought. She had been sick on the back step for 10 minutes and then gone back inside and thought nothing of it. 3 women had seen it. And now it was evidence. I ate something that didn't agree with me, she said. But her voice had lost a fraction of its certainty, and Vivian heard it, and the crowd heard it, and Clara watched the calculation move across Vivian's face like sunlight crossing a floor. Of course, Vivian said. Of course you did. The crowd's silence shifted. It had a new texture now, not just curiosity, something heavier, something that had already reached a verdict. Clara felt the ground changing beneath her. What happened next came from the crowd's left side, a man's voice, low, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who never needed to raise his volume to be heard. That'll be enough. No one saw Jackson Reed approach. That was the thing people talked about later. He was simply not there. And then he was sitting on his black horse at the edge of the gathering, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, his expression utterly unreadable. Jackson Reed was 34 years old. He had owned the Diamond Ridge Ranch outside Willow Creek for 6 years, having bought it with money he'd earned working cattle drives across 3 states before most men his age had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. He was known for his fairness in business, his refusal to be cheated, and his absolute indifference to the opinion of people he didn't respect. He was not a man who involved himself in town gossip, which was why every person in that crowd went completely still when he spoke. "What did you say?" Vivian turned toward him with the careful expression of someone measuring a threat they weren't yet sure how to classify. Jackson stepped down from his horse with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere to be. He looped the reins around the post nearby and turned to face the crowd, and when he looked at Vivian Caldwell, he looked through her in a way that clearly unsettled her. "I said that's enough." He moved through the crowd which separated for him the way it had for Clara, and came to stand roughly 3 feet from where she stood. Not beside her yet. Not quite. Just near enough to make his position unmistakable. Then he looked at the crowd, all of them sweeping his gaze slowly from face to face, and he said the words that would define the next 6 months of Clara Whitfield's life. "If she's having a child," he said quietly, "it's mine." The silence that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. It was total, complete. It pressed in from every direction with the weight of 30 people holding their breath simultaneously, and then it shattered. Ying. The talking started all at once and went in 6 directions. Clara heard her own name repeated multiple times. She heard Jackson's. She heard someone say, "Well, I never," and someone else say, "Jackson Reed of all people," and a man near the back actually laughed, though he stopped immediately when Jackson looked at him. Vivian Caldwell's composure cracked for the first time. "That is—" She stopped, started again. "You can't simply walk up and claim, 'I just did,'" Jackson said, "but everyone knows." "Everyone knows what you told them," Jackson said evenly, "which is different from the truth in my experience." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Clara watched something move across her face, the calculation again, but faster now, and less confident. Vivian was used to controlling the terms of a conflict. She was not accustomed to someone stepping into the middle of one of her narratives and simply rewriting it. "You're lying," Vivian said flatly. "Everyone can see you're lying. You barely know this woman." "I know her well enough," Jackson said. "And what I know is that she's a decent woman who minds her own business and doesn't deserve to be standing in the street while you settle a score for your brother." That last part landed like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples moved outward. Several people in the crowd exchanged looks. Vivian's brother. The failed proposal. People were connecting the points now. The story they'd swallowed whole an hour ago was developing cracks, and the light was getting in. "This isn't about Thomas," Vivian said, but her voice had a new quality in it. Defensive. "Then what is it about?" Jackson asked. No answer. "Because from where I'm standing," he continued, "it looks like a woman got her feelings hurt and decided to use a lie to do it. And I'm telling you plainly in front of everyone here that the lie stops today." Clara had not moved since Jackson appeared. She wasn't sure she could have. Her legs had gone strange, not weak exactly, more like they'd forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and watched a man she barely knew dismantle a situation that had been swallowing her whole, and she couldn't quite make sense of what she was seeing. She had expected anger from the crowd. She'd prepared herself for that. Anger she could fight. She had not prepared for rescue, and something about being rescued unexpectedly by a stranger in front of everyone was more destabilizing than the attack had been. Jackson turned to her for the first time since he'd made his declaration. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a dark, serious gray, and they were looking at her with a directness that was neither unkind nor particularly warm. Just honest. The way you look at someone when you want them to understand something clearly. "You all right?" he asked. It was possibly the simplest question anyone had asked her in years. "I don't know what you just did," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "We can talk about that later. Right now, let's get you out of this street." I don't need—" She stopped herself, reconsidered. "Thank you," she said instead. "But I haven't agreed to anything you just said." Something shifted in his expression. The smallest movement, almost like the beginning of a smile, quickly controlled. "Noted," he said. "You can disagree with me privately. Right now, in front of these people, I need you to walk with me." Clara looked at the crowd. She looked at Vivian Caldwell, whose face had settled into a cold, bright fury that was far more genuine than any of her earlier performances. She looked at the 30-odd people who had watched a stranger claim her child as his own without blinking. She made a decision. She walked. They went to the end of Main Street without speaking. Jackson's horse followed them, which Clara found oddly steadying the sound of the animal's hooves on the dry ground, patient and regular behind them. When they turned the corner onto a quieter road away from watching windows and open doorways, Clara stopped walking and turned to face him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Jackson Reed. I have the ranch outside town, east side past the mill." "I know who you are," she said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her steadily. "What did you ask? Why did you do that?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone gathering courage or avoiding the question. The silence of someone who had learned to be careful with words and was choosing the right ones. "I've watched that kind of thing happen before," he said. "A crowd finding something to be righteous about. A woman standing alone in the middle of it with no one willing to step up. I've seen what happens after that." He paused. "I wasn't going to watch it happen again." Clara studied him. She was a practical woman. She had lived alone and run a business for 4 years, and learned early that sentimentality was a luxury she couldn't afford. She looked at people the way you look at accounts, column by column, checking for inconsistencies. He didn't look like a man performing generosity. He looked like a man who had done something he'd decided to do a long time ago and was only now getting the opportunity. "You understand what you've started," she said. "I do. The whole town thinks I know what they think. And you're comfortable with that." He met her eyes. "Are you—" That silenced her for a moment. She had expected him to be the one explaining himself, and instead he'd turned the question back to her with a calm that was almost aggravating. "I'm not comfortable with any of this," she said. "I was minding my business this morning. I had nothing to do with your decision, and now I'm attached to a lie I didn't choose, and I don't know what to do with that." "That's fair," he said. "Is that all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to explain yourself," she said, and she was surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. "Because you walked into my life uninvited and changed it, and the least you owe me is a reason." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Can I show you something instead?" She shouldn't have gone with him. She knew that. Every practical corner of her mind told her that getting on a horse with a man she'd exchanged fewer than 20 words with in her entire life was not a reasonable response to the morning she'd had. But the alternative was going back to the boarding house, and the boarding house was on Main Street, and Main Street was currently full of people who had just watched Jackson Reed claim her unborn child as his. She was not ready to walk back into that. So she went. The ride to Diamond Ridge took 40 minutes. Jackson said almost nothing during the ride, and she appreciated that more than she could articulate. She was still processing the morning, still sorting through the sequence of events, and she needed the silence to do it. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected. She had heard of Diamond Ridge, most people in Willow Creek had, but she'd never had reason to come out this far. The main house was solid and unpretentious, built from good timber with a long front porch and windows that let in the eastern light. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained. Working cattle dotted the far pasture. It looked like a place that was cared for, not just owned. Jackson brought her inside and offered coffee, which she accepted, and they sat at the kitchen table with their cups and the particular awkwardness of two people who have been thrown together by extraordinary circumstances and are now required to behave normally. "Tell me about the sister," Clara said. He looked up from his cup. "You mentioned you'd seen it happen before. A woman standing alone. You said again. She watched his face. Who was it? For the first time since she'd met him, Jackson Reed looked like something had gotten under his guard. He set his cup down. Her name was Anna, he said. She was my younger sister. She came to a town in Wyoming about 8 years ago. She'd gone out there to work as a teacher. She was 19. He was quiet for a moment. A man in the town wanted to court her. She wasn't interested. He had a mother who had a reputation for making life difficult for women who crossed her sons. He paused. The story she started about Anna was bad enough that the school board removed Anna from her position. And the women in the town, the decent ones, the ones Anna had thought were her friends, they just let it happen. They stood by. Clara waited. I didn't find out until 3 weeks later. When I got there, Anna had already left. She'd gone to stay with an aunt in Oregon. She was... His jaw tightened. She wasn't the same after. She never really recovered from it. Not the full Anna. Something had been taken. Clara looked at her hands around the coffee cup. I'm sorry, she said. I stood by too, Jackson said. That's the part I carry. I wasn't there, which is the same as standing by. I should have... He stopped. It doesn't matter what I should have done. I didn't do it. And this morning when I came into town and saw that crowd, and I saw you standing in the middle of it alone... He looked at her directly. I wasn't going to let it happen again. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside somewhere on the ranch, a horse whinnied, and another answered. The fire in the kitchen stove ticked and settled. I'm not your sister, Clara said carefully. No, Jackson said. You're not. And I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not even to make your conscience easier. Something moved in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. I'm not asking you to, he said. Then what are you asking? He thought for a moment. I'm asking you to give me a chance to make right what I started, he said. I went into that crowd without thinking it through completely. You didn't ask for my help, and now you're in a situation that's partly my creation. That's on me. I'd like the chance to help you figure out what comes next. Clara looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. People who were hiding something looked away. All right, she said at last. But I need you to understand something. Tell me. I've been managing my own life for 4 years without a man's help. I am not going to start being managed now. If you want to help me, you help me. You don't make decisions for me. You don't speak for me unless I ask you to. You don't arrange my life to suit your own sense of what it should look like. She held his gaze. Are we clear? Jackson Reed looked at her with that same expression, the one that was not quite a smile, but contained something related to it. Yes, ma'am, he said. Good. She picked up her coffee. Now tell me what you actually think happens next, because I need to think this through, and 2 heads are better than 1. They talked for 2 hours. It was not the conversation either of them had expected to be having at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in early October. But it was thorough and honest, and by the end of it, Clara understood one thing clearly. The lie Jackson had told, whatever his intentions, had created a situation that could not simply be walked back. The town would not accept a quiet retraction, not Vivian Caldwell certainly. If Jackson stood up tomorrow and said he'd been mistaken, it would look like he'd abandoned Clara, and the rumor would continue with added ammunition. Now the man who'd originally claimed responsibility had retreated. Whatever ground Clara had gained from Jackson's intervention would be lost. Which means, Clara said slowly, that we have to either let it continue as it is, or we have to change the story entirely. That's the way I see it, Jackson agreed. Neither option is good. No. She thought for a moment. What do the people in this town actually respect about you? He raised an eyebrow slightly. Not flattery, she said. Information. What is it that makes people treat your word as credible? I don't lie, he said. I've been in this county for 6 years, and I've never had a contract dispute or a debt outstanding or a handshake I walked back from. People know that what I say is what I mean. "Which makes this morning a problem," Clara said. He nodded. "Because you lied," she said quietly. "For good reasons. But you lied. And if that comes out, it'll undermine everything I just did for you," Jackson said. "I know. So the question is, how to make it not a lie." He looked at her carefully. She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not proposing anything," she said quickly. "I'm thinking out loud. Don't read into it." "I'm not," he said. But the careful look remained. They sat with that for a moment, the implication hanging in the kitchen air between them like smoke from the stove. Outside, the morning was warming, and the ranch was going about its daily work. And in Willow Creek, Clara knew the story was spreading to every corner of every street. By evening, it would be at the church. By tomorrow morning, it would be at the schoolhouse. By the end of the week, everyone within 30 miles would know that Jackson Reed had stood in the street and claimed Clara Whitfield's child as his own. What they did with that, what shape they gave it, would determine the next chapter of both their lives. Clara Whitfield set down her empty cup, looked at the man across the table from her, and made herself ask the question she'd been turning over since the moment he'd ridden into that crowd. "Why did you really choose me?" she asked. "Out of everyone this town has ever treated badly. Why this morning? Why me?" Jackson was quiet for a very long time. When he answered, his voice was careful and deliberate, the way it always was. But underneath the control, she heard something she hadn't expected, something honest. "Because you didn't look afraid," he said. "You looked angry. And I've never in all my years seen a woman standing alone in that kind of crowd, up against those kinds of odds, and still looking angry instead of afraid." He paused. "That takes something. I didn't know what to call it at the time. I just knew I didn't want to watch it get crushed." Clara sat very still. Outside, the wind came up across the Montana plains, bending the dry grass in long silver waves. Inside the kitchen of Diamond Ridge Ranch, two strangers sat across a table from each other, connected now by a lie, told for the right reasons, and neither of them knew yet what that connection would become. But it had already changed them both. Clara Whitfield, who had never asked for protection in her life, had been given it anyway, by a man she hadn't chosen, and for reasons she was only beginning to understand. And Jackson Reed, who had spent 8 years carrying a guilt that had no outlet, had finally done the thing he wished he'd done when it mattered. He had stepped forward. What happened now was up to both of them, and whatever it was, it would not be simple. But then, nothing real ever was. The ride back to Willow Creek that afternoon was Clara's idea. Jackson had suggested she stay at Diamond Ridge until the worst of the gossip settled, a day, maybe two, and she had looked at him with an expression that told him he had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. "I have 12 boarders," she said. "Dinner doesn't cook itself." "I have a cook," he offered. "Your cook doesn't feed my boarders." He didn't argue further. He'd already learned something important about Clara Whitfield in the past 2 hours. She wasn't the kind of woman you argued into a corner. You either persuaded her with logic, or you stepped aside, and he didn't have the logic. So they rode back together, and this time the silence between them had a different texture. Not the rawness of the morning. Something that had been broken open and was now settling into a new shape. When Main Street came into view, Clara sat straighter in the saddle. Jackson noticed. He didn't comment on it. The town had not forgotten. Towns like Willow Creek never forgot, not within a single afternoon. People found reasons to be near their windows when the two of them rode in. Clara felt the watching like a physical thing. Dozens of eyes calculating the meaning of her returning beside Jackson Reed. The two of them side by side on the road, easy as if this were something they did every day. She kept her chin level. Let them look. Jackson walked her to the boarding house door. "Tomorrow," he said quietly before she went inside. "People are going to start asking questions. Real ones. Not gossip. They'll want to know what this is." "What do you want it to be?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I want it to be whatever gives you the most ground to stand on." She studied him for a moment. "Come for breakfast," she said. 7 o'clock. We'll figure out the story." He nodded once. She went inside. Through the window she watched him remount and ride back down Main Street, and she noticed with the careful attention she gave to everything that he didn't hurry. He moved through the town at his own pace, unhurried, making himself visible. Making a point without saying a word. Whatever else Jackson Reed was, he was not a man who did things halfway. That evening, two of her boarders gave notice. The first was Mr. Calloway, a mining supervisor who had been at the boarding house for 3 months and had always paid on time and caused no trouble. He knocked on the office door after supper, hat in hand, and told her without meeting her eyes that he'd found other accommodations. He was sorry. He hoped she understood. She understood perfectly. The second was Mr. Abbott, the schoolteacher. He took longer, stood in the doorway for almost a full minute in visible internal conflict, before finally saying that the school board had certain expectations of its employees, and he didn't think he could afford the appearance. "I understand," Clara said before he finished the sentence. He looked relieved and miserable in equal measure. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield. You've always been the boarding house has always been it's not what I think." "I know," she said. "Good night, Mr. Abbott." After he left, she sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, and she did not cry. She had made a decision years ago that she would not cry over things. She couldn't change, but she felt the weight of the evening settle into her bones, like cold working through a coat. 2 rooms, 2 incomes, and tomorrow there would likely be more. She opened the household ledger and looked at the numbers with the clear-eyed practicality she had always used to survive. The math was not good. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it wasn't good. She closed the ledger and went to bed and told herself that tomorrow was a different problem. Jackson arrived at 6:45. She noticed he was early the same way she noticed everything, without comment, filing it away. She poured his coffee and set a plate in front of him and sat across the table, and for a few minutes they simply ate because it was early, and the day was still quiet, and there was something to be said for beginning a difficult conversation on a full stomach. "2 boarders left last night," she said finally. Jackson looked up. "Which ones?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Anyone else likely to go?" "I don't know yet. 2 more are watching to see what happens." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I need to understand something. The story you told the crowd, the claim you made, how long do you intend to hold to it?" "As long as it takes to protect your reputation." "That could be a very long time." "I know." "And you're willing to do that?" He looked at her steadily. "I said what I said in front of half this town. I don't take things back." Clara set down her cup. "But at some point, the truth comes out. It always does. A child that never appears. A relationship that no one can account for. People will notice the inconsistencies, and when they do, your word, the one thing you said protects you in this town, will be questioned." She watched him take that in. "You've thought about this more than I have," he said. "I've been awake since 3 in the morning." Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, she would have hated that. Something more like recognition. "Then tell me what you think the options are," he said. "I see 3. She kept her voice even. "First, you quietly let the story fade. You don't retract it publicly, but you stop supporting it, and eventually people assume you two had a falling out, and the child, which never existed, is no longer discussed. I lose 2 more boarders probably, and my reputation takes permanent damage, but the immediate crisis passes." "That leaves you with the damage," Jackson said. "Yes. Second option, you retract it publicly. You go to the crowd, or you tell someone credible and you say you spoke out of turn. People assume you felt sorry for me and said something rash. My reputation stays damaged, yours is questioned for lying, and Vivian Caldwell gets everything she wanted." "That one benefits nobody," Jackson said. "No. Third option." She paused. We give the story a real foundation. The kitchen was very quiet. Jackson put down his fork. I'm not proposing anything, Clara said for the second time in 12 hours. I'm laying out the logical options. I understand that, Jackson said. His voice was careful. Walk me through what you mean by foundation. If people believe there's a genuine relationship between us, a serious one, the story becomes credible. It stops being a lie that needs to be managed and becomes something that can simply exist. The questions change. People stop asking if the claim was false and start asking when the wedding is. She said the last part matter-of-factly the way she said everything, and she watched his face for a reaction. What she got was not what she expected. He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look reluctant. He looked like a man examining a proposal with serious intent, the way she'd seen him look at the map of his property when she'd noticed it on the wall, calculating practical honest. You're describing a courtship, he said. I'm describing a practical arrangement that solves a problem we both created, she said. You created the claim. I came back with you instead of standing my ground in the street. We've already started this, whether we meant to or not. A courtship, he said again quietly, almost to himself. Call it whatever you need to call it, Clara said. What I'm saying is that if you're serious about protecting my name, this is the most effective way to do it. Short of... She stopped. Short of making it real, he finished. She met his eyes. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, the town was waking up. A wagon rattled past. Somewhere down the street, the blacksmith's hammer started up its morning rhythm. I have a condition, Jackson said. She waited. If we do this, whatever shape it takes, I need it to be honest between us. I won't lie to your face, even if we're maintaining a story for the town. Between these walls in private, I need us to be straight with each other. Clara considered that. Agreed, she said. And I have a condition. Tell me. This doesn't make me yours. It doesn't make me a woman you've taken charge of. We are two people managing a complicated situation together, and every decision we make together. Equally. Jackson held her gaze for a long moment. That's how I'd want it anyway, he said. They shook hands across the breakfast table in the quiet of the morning, and it was possibly the strangest agreement either of them had ever made, and neither of them quite knew what it would become. The campaign Clara thought of it as a campaign because she was nothing if not practical, began the same afternoon. Jackson came back at noon and walked with her through town on the pretense of business at the hardware store. He stayed close, but didn't hover. He spoke to the men he knew and introduced Clara naturally, the way you'd introduce someone who was already part of your life and didn't require announcement. Clara played her part with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything. She didn't perform warmth she didn't feel. She simply was there beside him in a way that said clearly, this is where I am, and I'm not moving. People watched. Of course they did. But watching changed when you saw something with your own eyes. A rumor was hearsay. A woman walking calmly through town beside the man who had claimed her was evidence. By mid-afternoon, the conversation at the general store had shifted. Mrs. Hennessy, who ran the counter, told her sister that evening that Clara Whitfield had looked perfectly composed. Not like a woman caught in a lie, like a woman who knew exactly where she stood. Vivian Caldwell heard that report secondhand, and her expression by all accounts was not a pleasant one. The first real test came 3 days later. The Willow Creek Ladies Charitable Society met every Thursday afternoon at the Methodist Church, and it was the single most powerful social institution in town. If those women decided you were acceptable, doors opened. If they decided you weren't, they closed, and stayed closed. Clara had been a member for 2 years. She had baked for their fundraisers and sewn for their winter clothing drives and attended every meeting without fail. She went that Thursday the same way she'd gone to Main Street on the morning of the rumor, because she was innocent and she refused to behave like she wasn't. She arrived 4 minutes early. The silence that met her at the church door was immediate and complete. 12 women. Half of them she'd known for years. 3 of them she had personally helped during hard times, meals delivered, rooms offered at reduced rates. Shoulders she'd made available without asking for anything in return. They looked at her the way people look at something they're not sure how to categorize. Margaret Hines, who had come to warn her 3 days ago, at least met her eyes. Geraldine Park, whose daughter Clara had nursed through a fever 18 months earlier, looked away. That was the one that hurt. Clara sat down in her usual chair, took out her sewing, and began to work. For 4 minutes, no one said a thing. Then Eleanor Marsh, who was 70 years old and had survived 2 husbands and 3 floods, and had the particular confidence that came from outlasting everything that had tried to destroy her, said from the head of the table, "Well, we might as well start the meeting." And they did. Clara didn't say anything for the first 15 minutes. She sewed and listened and waited. The way she waited for everything with patience that looked like stillness but was actually something much more active underneath. It was Bess Holloway who finally cracked. Bess was 40, quick-tongued and constitutionally unable to leave things unspoken. "I heard Jackson Reed came to breakfast at your place," she said, looking at Clara with the wide, innocent eyes of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. "He did," Clara said without looking up from her sewing. 3 mornings this week." "That's right." "Well," Bess paused. "That's something." "Is it?" Clara looked up then, and she looked at Bess with the calm, direct gaze she'd inherited from her mother. "A man has breakfast at a woman's house regularly. That seems like a perfectly natural thing in the circumstances." Bess opened her mouth, closed it. Eleanor Marsh made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Clara went back to her sewing. The meeting continued, but when it ended, Margaret Hines touched her arm on the way out briefly and said nothing, just squeezed once. It was the most human thing anyone had done for her all week, and Clara held on to it quietly all the way home. That evening, Jackson came for supper. This had become, over the past 3 days, a natural enough occurrence that the remaining boarders had stopped reacting to it. He ate at the end of the table, helped her clear up after, and then stayed a while in the kitchen, talking over the day. It was an arrangement that had established itself without either of them consciously designing it. She told him about the Ladies' Society meeting. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to appreciate. Most men filled silence. Jackson understood that silence was also information. "Eleanor Marsh," he said when she finished. She stayed neutral. Better than neutral. She redirected when things got pointed. "Eleanor Marsh has been a widow for 15 years and has more respect in this town than anyone alive," Jackson said. "If she's not against you, that matters." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not celebrating yet." "No," he agreed. "But it's something." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "Can I ask you something direct?" "You've never asked permission before," he said, and that not-quite smile appeared again. "Don't get used to it." She looked at him. "Are you doing this because of Anna?" The question landed without cushioning, the way Clara always asked things. Jackson was still for a moment. "I was," he said. "At first. You know that. I told you. And now," he looked at her steadily, "now I'm doing it because I think you deserve to have your name back, and because He stopped. She waited. "Because I find myself not particularly minding the arrangement," he said carefully. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very guarded way of saying something," she said. "I'm a guarded man." "I've noticed." "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Less than it probably should," she said. Something passed between them across the kitchen table. Neither of them named it. Both of them noticed it. Clara stood up and began putting cups away because she was a woman who dealt with uncertain feelings by doing something practical with her hands. "Same time tomorrow?" Jackson asked from where he sat. 7 o'clock, she said without turning around. She heard the quiet sound of him standing, the scrape of the chair, his boots crossing the kitchen floor to the back door. "Clara." She turned. He was standing in the doorway, hat in hand, the evening behind him. "I meant what I said this morning," he said. "In the street, when I made the claim." He paused. "I know you know it wasn't literally true, but the part underneath it, the part where I was saying you're not alone in this, that part was true." She looked at him for a moment. "Go home, Jackson," she said quietly. But her voice was different when she said it. He did. She stood in the kitchen for a while after not moving, just standing in the warmth of the stove with her hand resting on the edge of the counter. The feeling in her chest was different from the one she'd woken with 3 days ago. Still complicated. Still unresolved. But not the same cold thing. Something quietly had shifted. On Saturday, Vivian Caldwell made her next move. Clara had been expecting something. Vivian was not a woman who accepted a setback quietly, and the sight of Clara walking through town calm and accompanied and entirely unbothered had clearly been building toward some kind of response. The response came in the form of Thomas Caldwell, Vivian's brother. He found Clara at this market in the late morning between the vegetable stalls and the flour bins, in exactly the kind of semi-public location where a conversation could be witnessed without being quite overheard. Thomas was 28, handsome enough, and accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of his family's money and a charm that worked on women who weren't paying close attention. Clara had always been paying attention. "Miss Whitfield," he said, positioning himself in her path with the practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed the approach. She stopped, looked at him. "Thomas, I heard about the trouble you've been having," he said. "I want you to know whatever Vivian said, she spoke out of turn. She was protective of me, and she went too far." Clara waited. "I'd like to make it right," he said. "If you were willing to, if we could perhaps have dinner, and I could—" "No?" Clara said. He blinked. "I'm offering to help you." "You're offering to reinstate me," Clara said evenly, "as if it's within your power to take away what your sister started and then hand it back. It isn't, and I don't need your dinner." His expression shifted. The charm fell away, and underneath it was something less pleasant, the bruised ego of a man who hadn't been refused often enough. "You do understand," he said quietly, moving almost imperceptibly closer, "that I could make things very difficult for you, if I chose to." "I understand that you think you could," Clara said. "I have resources that— Is there a problem here?" Both of them turned. Jackson Reed stood 6 feet away, holding a paper bag from the grain merchant, looking at Thomas Caldwell with the particular expression of a man who already knows the answer to the question he just asked. The silence stretched. Thomas Caldwell looked at Jackson, looked at Clara. Did the rapid calculation of someone confronting the specific situation where their confidence has dramatically outpaced the reality of the ground they're standing on? "No problem," Thomas said. "Good." Jackson's voice was level. He moved to stand beside Clara, not in front of her, not between her and Thomas, but beside her. The positioning was deliberate and precise. Thomas looked at them both for a moment longer, then turned and walked away without another word. Clara watched him go. She waited until he was out of earshot. "I had that," she said. "I know you did," Jackson said. "You didn't need to." "I know," he said again. "But I wanted to." She looked at him. The market bustled around them, noise and movement, and the ordinary business of a Saturday morning. And in the middle of it, they stood close enough that she could see the line of his jaw, the steadiness of his gray eyes, the way he was looking at her, not with satisfaction at having intervened, not with protectiveness that contained possession, just with honesty. "He's going to be a problem," she said. "Probably." Jackson agreed. "Vivian sent him." "Almost certainly. She's not done." "No," Jackson said. "She's not." He looked at the direction Thomas had gone. "But neither are we." He said it simply, without drama, and Clara felt it land in the center of her chest in a way that caught her off guard. We. Such a small word. Such an enormous territory it covered. She picked up her market basket, and they walked together toward the next stall, and the people around them watched with the specific attention of a town taking careful notes, and Clara let them watch. She was not afraid of being seen anymore. Whatever she and Jackson were to each other, it was real enough for her to stand next to him in daylight and not flinch. That was something. That night, Clara sat alone with the ledger again. 3 more boarders had quietly told her they were thinking of leaving by the end of the month, which meant by November, she would be running the boarding house at less than half capacity, and the numbers she had always kept carefully balanced would begin to fail. She was not a woman who panicked, but she was a woman who faced things. She sat with the ledger and the lamp and the truth of it for a long time, and then she closed it, went to her desk, and wrote a letter. It was addressed to the county courthouse 3 towns east, and it was a request for records property, transfer documents, land deeds, business licenses. She had heard something in passing at the ladies' society meeting. A half sentence from Bess Holloway about the Caldwell family's dry goods business and a disputed land claim from 5 years earlier that had quietly gone away. Gone away the way things went away when you had money and influence in a small county. She didn't know yet what she was looking for, but she'd learned long ago that when someone came after you with a lie, the most powerful thing you could do wasn't defend yourself. It was find the truth they were hiding. She sealed the letter, set it on the corner of the desk for the morning post, and went to bed. For the first time in a week, she fell asleep without the cold pressure in her chest. Whatever was coming, she was no longer facing it from the same ground she'd been standing on 6 days ago. The ground had changed, and so in ways she was only beginning to understand had she. The letter came back from the county courthouse 11 days later. Clara was at the kitchen table when it arrived, going over the week's accounts, with the careful attention of someone who already knew the numbers weren't good and was looking at them anyway, because looking away had never been her method. She heard the postman's knock, went to the door, and stood in the morning light with the envelope in her hands for a moment before she opened it. The records were standard. Property transfers, deed filings, business registrations going back 8 years. She'd requested everything under the Caldwell name, and the courthouse had been thorough. She read through the first 4 pages without finding anything unusual. On page 5, she stopped. There was a land transfer from 1877, 5 years ago, involving a parcel of river bottom land on the east edge of Willow Creek County. The original owner was listed as a man named Edwin Haverford. The transfer moved ownership to a holding company called Cascade Land Partners. 18 months after that transfer, Cascade Land Partners was dissolved and the land was registered under Caldwell Merchant Properties. None of that was inherently unusual. What was unusual was the price. Edwin Haverford had sold 40 acres of prime river bottom land for $60. $60. In 1877, 40 acres of river bottom land in a growing Montana county was worth 15 times that. More if you knew what was coming, and whoever had structured the transfer had clearly known something was coming, because within 2 years of the sale, the territorial government had announced a rail extension that ran directly through that bottomland. The Caldwell family had made a great deal of money from that announcement. Edwin Haverford, according to the public record, had sold just in time to miss all of it. Clara sat down slowly. She read the documents again, carefully, and then a third time. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know exactly what she was looking at, but she knew enough about business, about land, about the quiet machinery of influence in a small county to recognize that $60 for 40 acres of river bottom land was not a transaction that had occurred between 2 people operating freely and with equal information. Someone had known what that land was worth. Someone had made sure Edwin Haverford didn't. She folded the documents back into the envelope and sat with them for a long time. The question was not what the Caldwells had done. The question was what Edwin Haverford knew about what had been done to him, and whether he was still in the county. She found him through Margaret Hines, which was how she found most things in Willow Creek that required local knowledge. Margaret, for all her complicated position during the rumor, was fundamentally a woman who dealt in information. And when Clara came into the dry goods store that morning and asked without preamble whether she knew an Edwin Haverford, Margaret's eyebrows went up in a way that told Clara immediately she'd struck something real. "Edwin Haverford hasn't lived in Willow Creek proper for 4 years," Margaret said. "He has a small homestead about 7 miles north past the Benton Creek crossing. He sold most of his property, the good bottomland he had back in '77, and after that he sort of diminished." "Diminished how?" "Quieter, smaller. He used to come to town every week. Now he comes maybe once a month, buys what he needs and goes." Margaret looked at her carefully. "Why are you asking about Edwin Haverford?" "I'm following something," Clara said. Margaret studied her. "Does this have to do with the Caldwells?" Clara met her eyes. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Edwin Haverford was not a man who sold that land willingly. That was always the whisper. But nobody pushed on it because the Caldwells had the county recorder in their pocket, and there wasn't a piece of paper that said anything wrong had been done." She leaned forward slightly. "What kind of paper did you find?" "Enough to ask questions," Clara said. "Not enough to answer them. Not yet." Margaret pressed her lips together. "Be careful," she said. "The Caldwells don't play lightly." "I know," Clara said. "Neither do I." She told Jackson that evening. She had learned over the 2 weeks of their strange arrangement that Jackson listened best when you gave him the facts first and your conclusions after. He didn't like preambles. He'd told her once that most people buried the important thing in the middle of a long story, and he'd spent years training himself to find it better to just start with it. So she put the county documents on the table between them and said, "I think the Caldwell family stole Edwin Haverford's land 5 years ago, and I think the reason Vivian came after me hard enough to start a public rumor is because her family has been covering up something serious for years, and she's learned that attacking first is the best defense." Jackson looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then, $60. For 40 acres of river bottomland. In 1877. He looked up. The rail announcement came in '79. Yes. They knew, he said. Someone told them, or they found the survey records before they were public. Either way, they knew what that land would be worth, and Edwin Haverford didn't. Jackson sat back. The look on his face was not surprise. It was something more like the specific gravity of a man confirming something he had always half suspected. "Edwin Haverford was a decent man," Jackson said. "I knew him slightly back when I first came to the county. He had good bottomland and a solid homestead, and he was planning to pass it to his sons." He paused. "He has 2 sons. Both left the county. Last I heard, one of them was in Idaho." Clara watched him connect the points. "The Caldwells didn't just take his land," Jackson said. "They broke up his family. If I can get Edwin Haverford to talk," Clara said, "and if what he says matches what's in these records, then Vivian's rumor isn't the only story in Willow Creek that needs correcting." Jackson looked at her across the table. "You're not just trying to clear your name anymore," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not. This is bigger than the rumor. Much bigger." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When do you want to go see Haverford?" She had not asked him to come. She noticed that, and she noticed equally that she was not going to tell him not to. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early. I'll be here at 6. Edwin Haverford was a man who had been diminished the way Margaret had said, but not in the way Clara had feared. He had not been broken. He had simply folded himself inward, pulled his edges in the way a person did when the world had reached in and taken something fundamental, and they needed to protect what remained. He was 63 years old, lean and weathered, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to be deliberate about who he trusted. He looked at Jackson first, then at Clara. "What do you want?" he asked. They were standing on his porch, and he had not invited them in yet, and his expression was the expression of a man who had answered his door to bad news before and was prepared to do it again. I want to ask you about a land transaction from 1877, Clara said. I want to know what really happened when you sold the bottomland. The change in his face was immediate and total, not anger, not fear. Something older than both of those, the expression of a person seeing a door they had long believed was sealed forever open by even a fraction. He stepped back. "Come inside," he said. Edwin Haverford talked for 2 hours. It came out of him in the particular way that things came out of people who had been holding them for a long time, not smoothly, not in order, circling back and correcting itself and stopping when the emotion got too close, before pushing forward again. The story was worse than the documents had suggested. In 1877, the territorial government had commissioned a private survey of potential rail routes through the county. That survey was not public. But the man who conducted it, a surveyor named Collins, had close ties to Harold Caldwell Vivian and Thomas's father. Harold Caldwell had known about the bottomland's value before anyone else in the county. He had approached Edwin Haverford with a story about flooding risk. He had produced what he claimed were engineers' reports, suggesting that the river bottomland was likely to flood catastrophically within 5 years, making it worthless. He had offered $60 as a kindness, more than it would be worth after the flooding, he said. Edwin Haverford had 3 sons to provide for. He had believed the engineers' reports. He had sold. There had been no flooding. There had been no engineer. The reports were fabricated. Harold Caldwell had known all of this and had done it deliberately. "I tried to find a lawyer," Edwin said. 3 years after the rail came through, when I understood what had been done. I found a man in the county seat who said he'd take the case." He stopped. 2 weeks later he wrote and said he couldn't help me. Didn't say why, just that he couldn't. Clara looked at Jackson. Jackson's jaw was tight. "What did the lawyer's name was?" Jackson asked. Edwin told him. Jackson was still for a moment. "He's on retainer with the Caldwell family," he said quietly. "Has been for years." The room went silent. Edwin looked at his hands. "I've lived with it for 5 years," he said. "I have my homestead. It's smaller. My youngest son left because there wasn't enough work. My oldest went after him. I have what I have." He paused. "I stopped fighting because I thought there was nothing left to fight with." Clara leaned forward. "There might be now," she said. They rode back to town in a silence that had weight and shape. Jackson rode with his jaw still set, and Clara recognized that particular quality in him. Now it was the face he wore when something had crossed a line he didn't speak about often. "Harold Caldwell is dead," Clara said after a while. 3 years ago, Jackson confirmed, "which means the surviving beneficiaries are Vivian and Thomas. And their mother, Patricia, she's mostly kept out of town business." He paused. "But the property is in all 3 names now. I'm certain of that." "The fraudulent survey," Clara said. "The fabricated engineers' reports. If those documents still exist somewhere, if," Jackson said, "or if Collins the surveyor is still alive and could be found, that's a bigger if." Clara pressed her lips together. "I know. But Edwin Haverford has been living with this for 5 years, believing he had no recourse. I want to find out if that's actually true." Jackson looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need a lawyer, a real one, not one on retainer with anyone in this county. The nearest reputable one is in Helena." "Then we write to Helena." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," his voice was careful. "I know," she said. "This is not my fight to start. It's Edwin's. I'm not doing anything without his permission." "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. "I was going to say that if you go after the Caldwells with this, they will hit back. Harder than the rumor. They have money and connections, and they are not above using both." He met her eyes. "I want to know that you understand that before you go further." Clara held his gaze. "I understood that the morning Vivian stood in the street and turned 30 people against me with 3 sentences, she said. "I have been understanding that every day since." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and it was the silence of two people who have made a decision together and are already moving toward what comes next. The proposal happened on a Thursday. Not that evening. Not in some planned, constructed moment. It happened the way most real things happen, sideways in the middle of something else, when neither of them was prepared for it. It was 3 weeks after Edwin Haverford's kitchen. Jackson had been coming to breakfast every morning and supper most evenings, and they had fallen into a rhythm that had stopped feeling like a performance weeks ago, if it had ever really felt like one at all. He fixed things around the boarding house without being asked. She kept his coffee refilled without comment. They argued about small things. He thought she worked too late. She thought he left too early, and agreed on the large ones with a frequency that had started to unsettle both of them. They had written to a lawyer in Helena. The lawyer had written back with cautious interest and a request for the original documents. Clara had sent them with a detailed letter she'd written and rewritten 4 times until it was exactly right. That Thursday evening, she was in the sitting room going over the lawyer's most recent correspondence, and Jackson was nearby reading through some ranch accounts he'd brought over, and it was exactly the ordinary domestic scene it looked like, which was what had been unnerving Clara for the past week. She looked up from the letter. He was across the room, entirely focused on his papers, the lamplight doing something uncomplicated and honest to his face. And she realized quietly, without fanfare, the way true things arrived, that she was not afraid of him anymore. She had been at the beginning. Not afraid of violence or harm. Afraid of need. Afraid of what it would mean to depend on someone because everything she had ever depended on had eventually been taken. She wasn't afraid of that now, which told her something she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. "Jackson." He looked up. She set the letter down. "What do you actually want from this?" He set his papers down too. He understood from her voice that they had shifted into the real conversation. "From what?" he asked. But he knew. "From this," she said. "From us. From whatever this has become." She kept her voice steady. "Because it's become something. And I think we've both been pretending not to notice." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think it's become?" he asked. "Don't answer my question with a question." Almost a smile. "I want what I said that first morning," he said. "I want to build something real, but I didn't know when I said it whether that was possible with someone I'd just met in the middle of a disaster." He paused. "I know more now. And I think it's possible." He looked at her directly. "More than possible." Clara looked at her hands. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have strong opinions. I keep my own hours. I don't defer to anyone just because they're in the room." "I know," he said. "That doesn't bother you?" "No." "Why not?" He thought for a moment with the genuine care he brought to answering things that mattered. "Because I've spent 6 years building a ranch by myself," he said. "And the part that's been missing isn't someone to defer to me. It's someone to argue with. Someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong and be right about it." He paused. "You've been right about me twice this week, and you didn't soften it either time." Clara stared at him. "That is possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not a real one. It changed his face entirely, made him younger, easier, more fully himself. "I'm not a romantic man," he said. "I'm an honest one. I think you'd rather have that." "I would," she admitted. "Which is the problem?" "Why is it a problem?" "Because you're making it very difficult to maintain appropriate distance," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Then don't." The words sat in the air between them. "Is that a proposal?" Clara asked. "It's the beginning of one," he said. "The actual proposal would require me to be somewhat more formal and considerably more nervous." "Are you nervous?" "Considerably," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had stepped into a street on a Tuesday morning and changed everything. This man who had told her about his sister in a quiet kitchen and not looked away when his voice got close to breaking. This man who had ridden 7 miles to sit in Edwin Haverford's house and listened with his jaw tight and his hands still and his eyes clear. This man who laughed at himself and answered hard questions honestly and had never once, in all the weeks they'd shared, this strange arrangement made her feel small. "Ask me properly," she said. He set down his ranch accounts, pushed back his chair, crossed the room. He didn't kneel. They were both too practical for theater. He simply stood in front of her and looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without calculation, with the specific honesty that had been the thing about him from the beginning. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "I'm not asking you because of the rumor, and I'm not asking you out of some misguided sense of obligation, and I'm not asking you to rescue either of us from an uncomfortable situation. I'm asking because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, I realized that the best part of my day is the part where you're in it." He paused. "Will you marry me?" Clara Whitfield, who did not cry over things she couldn't change, felt something press against the back of her eyes that was not grief and not fear. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. He exhaled. She realized she hadn't been the only one holding her breath. By the next morning, the town knew. In Willow Creek, it was impossible to keep something like that private, and neither of them had particularly tried. Jackson had gone directly from the boarding house to the land office. He had business there, and he had answered questions about it simply and without elaboration when they were asked. Clara had told Margaret Hines, who had told 5 people before noon. The response split in exactly the way she'd expected. Most people accepted it with the particular relief of a town that had been holding an uncomfortable story and was now being offered a resolution. An engagement made sense of everything, or seemed to. People were good at accepting a story that let them stop feeling bad about how they'd behaved. Some people weren't ready to let go. Vivian Caldwell was at the post office when Clara walked in that afternoon, and the look on her face was not the cold fury of 2 weeks ago. It was something more calculating and more dangerous, the expression of a woman who has decided to change strategy. "Congratulations," Vivian said. Her voice was almost warm. "Jackson Reed is a good catch." Clara looked at her without expression. "Thank you, Vivian. It all worked out rather neatly, didn't it?" Vivian said. "A little trouble, a little drama, and now you're engaged to the most eligible man in the county." She tilted her head. "Some might say you handled the whole thing brilliantly." "Some might," Clara agreed pleasantly. "Of course," Vivian continued. "Others might wonder about a child that no one ever sees or hears of again. That tends to raise questions." Clara went very still. Vivian was watching her with a small, careful smile. Not hostile. Something more precise than that. She was testing for vulnerabilities, moving her fingers gently along the edges of a structure, looking for the place where it could crack. "I think people will be focused on the wedding," Clara said evenly. "Weddings are lovely distractions," Vivian agreed. "For a while." She left before Clara could respond. Clara stood in the post office for a moment, her heartbeat deliberate and her expression composed. Vivian had not retreated. She had regrouped. And somewhere inside that careful, pleasant smile was the clear message that the land documents, the courthouse records. The trip to Edwin Haverford's house, Vivian didn't know about any of it yet. But she was smart enough to know that Clara hadn't stopped fighting. She was watching for what came next, which meant Clara needed what came next to arrive before Vivian had time to prepare for it. She walked out of the post office into the bright October air and went straight to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the lawyer in Helena. 3 words. How soon possible? The lawyer's response came back by evening. 2 weeks. Come prepared. Clara folded the telegram and put it in her coat pocket and walked home in the cooling afternoon with the particular focus of a woman who has a plan and 2 weeks to execute it. Whatever Vivian Caldwell was planning, she was doing it without knowledge of Edwin Haverford's documents, without knowledge of a Helena lawyer who was already reviewing the case, without knowledge of what Clara had found and what she was building toward. For the first time since the morning in the street, Clara had the advantage. She intended to keep it. That night, she told Jackson about the telegram. He listened to all of it, the post office encounter with Vivian. The 3 words she'd sent, the lawyer's response with the same focused stillness he brought to everything that mattered. When she finished, he said, 2 weeks. We need to get Edwin Haverford to Helena, Clara said, or at least his formal testimony. He'll go, Jackson said. I'll ask him myself. And we need Collins. The surveyor. If he's alive and findable, I'll put some men on it tomorrow, Jackson said. I have contacts in 3 counties. If Collins is still in Montana, we'll find him. She looked at him across the table. You're taking this on like it's your fight. He held her gaze. You're going to be my wife, he said simply. That makes it my fight. Clara was quiet for a moment. There it was again, that thing she hadn't expected, had never quite prepared for. The feeling of someone standing on the same ground as her, not because they had to, but because they'd chosen to. Not despite who she was, because of it. Then we have 2 weeks, she said. We've done more with less, Jackson said. They got to work. What neither of them knew not yet was that Vivian Caldwell had made a visit of her own that same afternoon. Not to the post office, not to the market, to the county recorder's office. And whatever she had done there, or whatever she had arranged, would surface in exactly 11 days, at the worst possible moment, in front of exactly the people who mattered most. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. The 11 days passed, the way dangerous things always passed, deceptively quietly, with most of the real movement happening underneath the surface where it couldn't be seen. Jackson's men found Collins on day 4. The surveyor was not in Montana. He was in Billings working under a different name, a detail that told them immediately he had something to hide and had known it for years. One of Jackson's ranch hands tracked him through a cousin who did business in Billings, and by day 6, Jackson had a name, an address, and a very interesting letter from a man who was apparently not as comfortable with his secrets as he had once been. Collins had written the letter 3 years ago, sealed it, and given it to a Methodist minister in Billings, with instructions to open it upon his death. The minister, when approached, turned out to be a man of conscience, who had been troubled by the letter's contents for 3 years, and was quietly relieved to have a reason to act on that trouble. The letter was 4 pages long. It described in specific detail the private survey of 1877. It named Harold Caldwell as the man who had commissioned the false engineer's reports. It named the price paid for that commission. And it contained, at the bottom of the final page, a statement that Collins had made the decision to document the truth, because he had not slept well in 5 years, and did not expect to sleep better as he aged. Jackson brought the letter to Clara on the evening of day 6. She read it twice. Then she sat down heavily in the kitchen chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. This is it, she said. This is most of it, Jackson said carefully. We still need... No. She looked up. Jackson, this is enough. Combined with the courthouse records and Edwin Haverford's testimony, this is enough. He sat down across from her. He had read the letter already twice on the ride over. He knew what it contained. The lawyer in Helena needs to see this immediately, she said. I'll ride out tomorrow morning, Jackson said. I can be in Helena in 2 days. We both go, Clara said. He looked at her. I started this, she said. I'm there when it finishes. He didn't argue. They were 7 miles outside Willow Creek the next morning when Thomas Caldwell and 2 other men came up on them from the North Road. It happened fast, the way planned. Things always happened. One moment the road was empty, and the next there were 3 horses blocking the way forward, and Thomas was in the center with an expression that had moved well beyond bruised ego into something considerably uglier. Going somewhere, Thomas said. Jackson's hand moved to his side. Clara noticed equally that he kept it there, not reaching just ready. We're traveling, Jackson said. His voice was flat and very calm. Helena, I'm told. Thomas let that sit there. He looked at Clara. I think you ought to know that whatever you're carrying to that lawyer is not going to land the way you're expecting. Is that right? Clara said. My family has been building this county for 20 years, Thomas said. You're one woman with a grudge and a box of old papers. That's not a case. That's an embarrassment. Then you have nothing to worry about, Clara said. Something moved across his face. The thing underneath the confidence, tighter, sharper, closer to fear. My mother is not well, he said. Whatever you think my father did dragging her through a legal proceeding won't bring anything back. It'll just hurt an old woman who had no part in it. Clara looked at him steadily. Edwin Haverford's youngest son lives in a boarding house in Idaho, she said. He sends his father $4 a month when he can spare it. Edwin hasn't seen either of his sons in 2 years because neither of them could afford to come home, and he couldn't afford to go to them. She kept her eyes on Thomas. I'm not here to hurt your mother. I'm here to correct a wrong. If your family had built this county honestly, we wouldn't be on this road. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You'll regret this, he said. Not as much as your father should have, she said. Jackson moved his horse forward. A slow, deliberate step, then another. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Thomas Caldwell's horse shifted sideways, and then the two men flanking him shifted, and the road opened. They rode through without looking back. When they were a quarter-mile clear, Clara let out the breath she'd been holding. You all right? Jackson asked. Yes, she said, and she was. But her hands were trembling slightly, and she was grateful her coat sleeves were long enough to cover it. What they didn't know, couldn't have known on that road, was what Vivian had done at the county recorder's office 9 days earlier. They found out in Helena. The lawyer's name was Robert Fisk, and he was 60 years old, and he had the particular manner of a man who had seen a great deal and retained the capacity to be surprised by very little of it. He read the Collins letter slowly and carefully, the way he read everything. He reviewed the courthouse documents Clara had sent weeks earlier. He listened to her account of Edwin Haverford's testimony, which she delivered from 3 pages of detailed notes she'd written on the ride. When she finished, Fisk took off his glasses and set them on the desk. This is substantial, he said. Enough to proceed? Jackson asked. In most circumstances, yes. He paused. There is, however, a complication. Clara had felt this coming since he said substantial instead of something warmer. Tell me, she said. 4 days ago, a deed amendment was filed with the Willow Creek County Recorder, Fisk said. It pertains to the original bottomland parcel, the Haverford property. The amendment includes an addendum signed by a notary, which claims that Edwin Haverford received additional compensation in 1879, a payment of $340, as a settlement for any disputes arising from the original transaction. Clara stared at him. That is a lie, she said. I don't doubt it, Fisk said. But it is a notarized lie filed 4 days ago which creates a counter-document to everything you've built here. If they can produce a notary and a witness who will testify to the 1879 settlement, they have a legal foundation to contest the entire claim. There was no settlement, Clara said. Edwin Haverford will say so himself. His word against a notarized document, Fisk said carefully, which is not impossible to overcome, but it makes the case harder, longer, and more expensive. Jackson leaned forward. Who notarized it? Fisk told him. Jackson sat back. He's been doing work for the Caldwells for 6 years, he said. That may be demonstrable, Fisk said. If we can show a pattern of association, the notary's credibility is weakened. He looked at Clara. This is still a viable case, Miss Whitfield. But I want you to understand what you're walking into. This will take time. It may take a year. The Caldwells will spend money to obstruct it, and they have more money than Edwin Haverford. Clara was quiet for a moment. Do you believe the documents support the claim? She asked. Yes, Fisk said, without hesitation. Clearly. And Collins, would his letter be admissible? With the right approach, yes. Then we proceed, Clara said. She glanced at Jackson. He nodded once. We proceed, he confirmed. Fisk looked at them both. All right, he said. Let's talk about how. They stayed in Helena 2 days. The first day was Fisk's office going through every document, building a sequence, identifying what was provable and what required additional evidence. Clara had brought her notes and her letters and a timeline she'd constructed over the past 2 weeks, and Fisk went through it all with the careful efficiency of a man who respected good preparation. At the end of the first day, he looked at Clara with something that had shifted in his expression. "You put this together yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. "You have no legal training." "None." "You run a boarding house." "I do." He looked at the organized stack of documents in front of him, the clear timeline, the carefully written account of Edwin Haverford's testimony. "You should have been a lawyer, Miss Whitfield," he said. Clara looked at him evenly. "Women aren't lawyers," she said. "No," Fisk said. "That's the only reason you aren't one." She was quiet for a moment. She didn't know what to say, which was unusual for her. Jackson, sitting beside her, said nothing. But when she glanced at him, he was looking at her with that expression, the one that was something more than the not-quite smile. Something that had no easy name but was entirely legible if you knew him well enough. She was beginning to know him well enough. The second day in Helena, while Jackson was in a meeting with Fisk about the financial structure of the case, Clara found Collins. She hadn't planned it. She'd been walking from the hotel to the post office and had stopped at a small coffee house, and the man sitting in the corner, thin somewhere in his 50s, with the specific look of someone trying to take up as little space as possible, matched the description one of Jackson's hands had given her. She went in and sat down across from him without asking permission. He looked up, startled. "Mr. Collins," she said. "My name is Clara Whitfield. I've read your letter." The color drained from his face so completely it was like watching a lamp go out. "How?" He stopped. "The minister. He gave it to people who are trying to correct what you helped do," Clara said. She kept her voice level, not unkind, but direct. "I'm not here to threaten you. I want you to understand that the document you wrote, the truth you recorded because you couldn't sleep, is going to be used. We have a lawyer. We have Edwin Haverford. We have the courthouse records. Your letter doesn't stand alone." Collins looked at his hands around his coffee cup. He was silent for a long time. "He threatened me," he said finally. "Caldwell, Harold Caldwell. He told me if I ever spoke about the survey, he'd make sure I never worked in Montana again." He paused. "I had a family. He stopped. "That's not an excuse." "No," Clara said quietly. "It isn't." He flinched. "But it's understandable," she added. "Powerful men make people afraid. That's how they've always maintained power. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." She looked at him directly. "I'm asking whether you're willing to come forward now, formally, with testimony." Collins was quiet for a very long time. "Harold's dead," he said finally. "Yes. His children, they don't know I exist." "They didn't until recently," Clara said. "But they've taken steps to protect themselves in the last 2 weeks that suggest they know something is coming. Which means time is something we don't have an excess of." Collins looked at her for a moment. "You're very direct," he said. "I'm in a hurry," she said. "And so is Edwin Haverford." Something moved across his face at that name. Something genuine, the particular look of a person confronting the specific human cost of an abstract wrong. Is Haverford all right?" "He's alive," Clara said. "He lost his land and his sons in 5 years of the life he should have had. He's managing." Collins closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. "I'll testify," he said. "Tell your lawyer." Clara exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Collins said. "I should have done it 4 years ago." She left money for his coffee on the table and walked out into the Helena Street and allowed herself for exactly 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she straightened her coat and walked back to Fisk's office to tell Jackson. Chung. They arrived back in Willow Creek on a Friday afternoon to find that the situation had escalated in ways they hadn't anticipated. Vivian had moved while they were gone. She had gone to the Ladies' Charitable Society and told them with the particular elegance of someone who knew how to dress a knife in silk that Clara Whitfield's engagement to Jackson Reed had been manufactured to cover an ongoing deception. That there had never been a child, which proved the whole story was false. That Jackson had been manipulated by a calculating woman who had used a public crisis to attach herself to the most eligible man in the county. That the real victim in this story was Jackson Reed, who deserved to know what he'd been drawn into. Clara heard all of this from Margaret Hines, who came to the boarding house within an hour of their return with the expression of a woman who had been waiting with bad news and was both relieved and troubled to be delivering it. "How did the society receive it?" Clara asked. "Mixed," Margaret said. Eleanor Marsh didn't say anything, which some people took as disapproval and others took as neutrality. Bess Holloway asked Vivian a question about her brother that Vivian didn't answer well. She paused. But two of the members went home and told their husbands, and the husbands have been talking. "About Jackson," Clara said. "About whether he was deceived," Margaret said. "Yes." Clara sat down. This was the one she'd feared most. Not an attack on her directly, she had weathered those. But an attack on Jackson's reputation framed as concern for him, turning him from her defender into her victim. "Where's Jackson?" Margaret asked. "He'll be here within the hour," Clara said. "He went to the ranch first to check on things." Margaret studied her. "What are you going to do?" Clara looked at the wall for a moment. "The only thing that works," she said. "The truth. All of it. In the open in front of everyone." Margaret looked uncertain. "That means admitting that the original claim was a lie told to protect me, yes," Clara said. "I know." She met Margaret's eyes. "But we have something the Caldwells don't have. We have Collins. We have Haverford. We have a lawyer in Helena and a letter that describes exactly what Harold Caldwell did in 1877. She paused. "The truth about my situation is complicated. The truth about theirs is simple. And simple truth in front of the right people is the most powerful thing there is." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor Marsh chairs the County Civic Committee," she said slowly. "They hold a public meeting every month. The next one is in 4 days." Clara looked at her. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" she said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Margaret said primly. "I'm providing information about the civic calendar." She stood up. "Eleanor Marsh owes you nothing, Clara, but she respects honesty, and she has despised the Caldwell family's manner of doing business for 15 years. She buttoned her coat. "I think if you went to see her this evening, she might find the civic committee meeting very interesting timing." She left. Clara sat alone in the kitchen for 3 minutes. Then she got her coat. 오셨쇼. Jackson arrived to find the boarding house empty and a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to see Eleanor Marsh. Don't worry, back before dark. See." He read it twice. Then he sat down in the kitchen chair and stayed there with the note in his hand, and on his face was an expression that no one in Willow Creek had ever seen on Jackson Reed before. It was something that looked from the inside like helplessness, but it was the specific helplessness of a man who has realized he loves someone strong enough to walk into difficulty without him, and has also realized that this is exactly what he loves about her, and that those two facts are in a constant, exhausting tension that he cannot resolve and would not change. He put the note in his coat pocket. He went to find his own preparations to make. Eleanor Marsh received Clara in her sitting room at 5 o'clock, and she was, as Margaret had described, a woman who had survived too much to spend time on pretense. She offered tea. Clara accepted. And then Eleanor sat across from her and said, "Tell me the truth, all of it, and do not soften it for my comfort." So Clara did. She told Eleanor about the morning in the street and what Jackson had said and why. She told her about the arrangement they'd made at breakfast the campaign to make it credible the proposal in the sitting room 3 weeks in. She told her about the county records and Edwin Haverford's kitchen and the ride to Helena and Collins in the coffee house. She told her about the deed amendment filed 4 days ago and the notarized lie and what Vivian had said at the Ladies' Society. She told all of it plainly, without ornamentation, and Eleanor Marsh listened without interrupting once. When Clara finished, Eleanor set down her teacup. "The child," Eleanor said. "There was none." "No." Jackson lied. "To protect me, yes." "And you built a genuine engagement on top of a false premise." "We built a genuine engagement on a real relationship that formed during an unusual situation," Clara said. "The premise was false. What grew from it isn't." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "Do you love him?" she asked. The directness of the question would have knocked Clara sideways 3 weeks ago. "Yes," she said. The word came out without hesitation, and she realized as she heard it that she'd known it for some time and hadn't yet said it out loud. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Harold Caldwell was a dishonest man," she said almost to herself. "I watched him operate for 20 years. I never had proof of anything specific. I simply knew the way you know some things without being able to point to them." She paused. "Edwin Haverford lost good land. I thought so at the time. I didn't speak." "You didn't know," Clara said. "I didn't ask," Eleanor said, which was a different thing, and they both understood the difference. She was quiet for a moment. "The Civic Committee meeting is in 4 days," she said. "It is a public forum. Items can be added to the agenda up to 48 hours in advance." Clara waited. "I would find it appropriate," Eleanor said, "for the matter of the Caldwell land transaction of 1877 to be presented to the community for discussion, with relevant documentation." She looked at Clara. "If such documentation were available." "It would be," Clara said. "And witnesses. Edwin Haverford will come," Clara said. "And the surveyor who conducted the original survey is prepared to testify in writing with an affidavit being prepared by a lawyer in Helena." Eleanor Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "You've been busy," she said. "I had motivation," Clara said. Something moved across Eleanor's face, something that in a younger woman might have been called a smile, and in Eleanor was simply a deepening of the lines around her eyes that meant the same thing. "Come to the meeting," Eleanor said. "Bring your documents. Bring Jackson Reed. And don't let Vivian Caldwell get there first." The next 3 days were the most concentrated work of Clara's life. Fiscus sent Collins's formal affidavit by express post from Helena, arriving the second day. Edwin Haverford came to town. Jackson had ridden out to tell him personally, and whatever he had said on that porch, it had been enough, and he sat at Clara's kitchen table and let her write out his account in the careful, precise language that would hold up in front of a committee, and he signed it with a hand that was steady, because he had been waiting 5 years for the use of that signature. Vivian knew something was happening. Clara could feel it, the specific pressure of someone tracking movement they couldn't fully see. She heard from Margaret that Thomas had been to the county recorder's office twice more. She heard that Patricia Caldwell, the mother who rarely left the house, had been seen at the bank with a lawyer Clara didn't recognize. They were circling, preparing, but they didn't know the shape of what was coming, only that it was coming, and that uncertainty was an advantage Clara intended to maintain for exactly 3 more days. On the evening before the meeting, Jackson came for supper, and when the last boarder had gone upstairs and the kitchen was quiet, they sat across from each other with empty plates and full cups, and the specific exhaustion of 2 people who have been running at full speed and are about to find out if it was fast enough. "I need to tell you something," Jackson said. Clara looked at him. "I spoke to Eleanor Marsh this afternoon," he said. "She told me what you told her, all of it." Clara waited. "I want you to know," Jackson said, "that I don't regret the lie I told, in the street that morning. I'd tell it again." He paused. "But I regret that it put you in a position where you had to defend both of us. You've been carrying the weight of 2 people's reputations for weeks, and most of it you've done while I was—" He stopped. "While I was useful, but you were leading." Clara looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking for an apology," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not offering one. I'm offering a recognition." He met her eyes. You are the most capable person I have ever known. And tomorrow, in front of that committee, whatever happens, it happens because of what you built. Not what I started. What you built." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara set down her cup. "We built it," she said. Her voice was firm and clear. "Don't take that from me by making it mine alone. We built it." He looked at her. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen, with the lamp burning low, and the town outside going about its evening, and neither of them needing to say anything more. Tomorrow was coming. They were ready. And in the morning, when Clara Whitfield walked into that civic committee meeting with Edwin Haverford on one side and Jackson Reed on the other, and a folder of documents that contained the full truth about the Caldwell family's most profitable and most dishonest moment, Vivian Caldwell looked at her from across the room and understood for the first time that she had fundamentally misjudged who she was fighting. She had started a rumor to destroy a quiet woman in a boarding house. What she had created instead was something she had no framework for. Eleanor Marsh called the meeting to order. Clara stood up, and the truth which had been waiting 5 years for exactly this moment finally walked into the room. Eleanor Marsh did not use a gavel. She simply raised one hand and the room went quiet, because 60 years of consequence had given her voice a weight that didn't require amplification. The Civic Committee met in the largest room at the town hall, and that Monday morning it was full in a way that civic meetings rarely were. Word had moved through Willow Creek the way word always moved, faster than anyone intended, with details added and subtracted along the way, and what people had heard was enough to bring them out on a cold October morning and fill every chair and line the walls 3 people deep. Clara sat at the front table with Edwin Haverford on her left and Jackson on her right. Fisk's documents were in a folder in front of her, organized in the sequence she and Jackson had worked out the night before. Edwin's hands were flat on the table. He had dressed carefully, his best coat, his good hat set on the chair beside him, and he was looking straight ahead with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is now sitting at the edge of it, trying to stay steady. Vivian Caldwell was in the 3rd row with Thomas beside her, and a lawyer Clara didn't recognize on his other side. Patricia Caldwell. The mother was not present. Vivian's face was composed in that particular way that had nothing to do with calm. It was the face of someone who has decided on a position and is holding it through force of will. Her eyes had moved to the folder in front of Clara the moment Clara sat down, and had not moved since. She knew. Not all of it maybe, but enough to know that the folder was dangerous. Eleanor called the meeting to order and stated the agenda item with the neutral precision of someone who had spent decades running public proceedings and understood that the chair's tone set everything that followed. "The matter before this committee," she said, "concerns a property transaction from 1877 involving Edwin Haverford and the late Harold Caldwell. Documentation has been submitted to this committee for review and testimony will be offered. This is a public forum. Everyone present will have the opportunity to speak in turn. We will conduct this with order and with the respect owed to all parties." She looked out at the room over the tops of her glasses, including the ones who are not in this room to speak for themselves. It was a precise statement. It was also, Clara recognized, a signal to Vivian to the room that Eleanor Marsh was not running this proceeding in anyone's interest but the truth's. Vivian's lawyer leaned toward Thomas and said something quietly. Thomas's expression tightened. Eleanor turned to Clara. "Miss Whitfield, you submitted the initial documentation. Please begin." Clara stood up. The room shifted, the particular settling of a group of people who have decided to pay attention. She did not use notes. She had written everything out twice and read it back until it was part of her, and she didn't need paper between herself and the room. "In October of 1877, she said, Edwin Haverford sold 40 acres of river bottom land to a holding company called Cascade Land Partners. The recorded sale price was $60. She paused. 40 acres of river bottom land in this county in 1877 was worth no less than $900 at fair market value. Mr. Haverford sold it for $60 because he was told by Harold Caldwell that the land was at severe risk of flooding based on engineers' reports that Mr. Caldwell provided. She let that sit for a moment. Those reports were fabricated. There were no engineers. There was no flooding risk. She opened the folder. The survey of that land was conducted in 1877 by a man named Arthur Collins, who was hired privately by Harold Caldwell before the official territorial survey was released. Mr. Collins' survey identified the land as optimal for the rail extension that was announced publicly in 1879. Harold Caldwell knew what that land would be worth before Mr. Haverford did, and he used false documents to acquire it at a fraction of its value. The room was completely silent. Clara placed Collins's affidavit on the table facing the committee. This is a sworn statement from Arthur Collins prepared and notarized in Helena 6 days ago, describing in specific detail the private survey he conducted, the false reports he was paid to support, and the instructions he received from Harold Caldwell. She placed the courthouse records beside it. These are the original deed transfer documents from the county recorder showing the sale price, the transfer to Cascade Land Partners, and the subsequent registration under Caldwell Merchant Properties following the dissolution of the holding company. She placed Edwin's signed account beside those. And this is Edwin Haverford's own testimony written in his words describing what he was told and what he lost. She sat down. The room breathed. Edwin Haverford stood up next, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than Clara's, but steadier than anyone had expected. He didn't use formal language. He didn't try to sound like a document. He spoke the way a man spoke when he was describing something that had happened to him, and he had spent 5 years not being able to tell anyone. He talked about the morning Harold Caldwell had come to his door. He described the engineers' reports, how official they had looked, how specific, how frightening. He talked about his 3 sons and the land he'd intended to pass to them, and the calculation he'd made, terrified that $60 now was better than worthless land in 5 years. He talked about the rail announcement in 1879. He talked about the morning he understood what had been done. He talked about his sons leaving. He did not cry. He didn't look for sympathy. He stated facts in sequence with the particular dignity of a man who has been diminished and knows it and is done with it. When he sat down, the silence was of a different quality than the silence that had followed Clara. That silence had been the silence of information being absorbed. This silence was the silence of something human landing in the chest of every person in the room. Margaret Hines had her hands pressed together in her lap. Bess Holloway was looking at the table. 2 men near the back wall were exchanging a look that contained several sentences. Eleanor Marsh looked at the Caldwell table. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "your family has been named in these documents. Do you wish to respond?" Thomas stood up. The lawyer beside him rose simultaneously and put a hand on his arm, but Thomas shook it off. "My father is dead," Thomas said. "Whatever he did or didn't do, he isn't here to answer for it. This is an attack on our family's name using unverifiable claims from people with grievances against us." "The Collins affidavit was notarized in Helena," Eleanor said, "by a notary with no professional connection to any party in this proceeding." "Collins was paid to lie once," Thomas said. "That's established by these documents. What reason do we have to believe he isn't lying again?" It was not a stupid argument. Clara had anticipated it. She stood up without waiting to be recognized. "May I respond?" Eleanor nodded. "Mr. Collins' statement is consistent in every specific detail with the courthouse records that predate it by 5 years," Clara said. "The sale price, the dates, the structure of the holding company. Those records were not created by Collins. They were created by your father's own lawyers and filed with this county. Collins didn't know what I had when he wrote his statement. He couldn't have calibrated a lie to match records he hadn't seen." She looked at Thomas steadily. "The documents corroborate each other because they describe the same event. That is what corroboration means." Several heads in the room nodded. Thomas looked at her with a fury that was now entirely undisguised. "The deed amendment," he started, "was filed 4 days before this meeting," Clara said, "by your family. 9 days after I submitted the original documents to a lawyer in Helena." She held his gaze. "That is not a historical record. That is a response." The room shifted again. She sat down. Jackson had not moved or spoken since the meeting began. He was sitting straight and still with his hands flat on the table, and Clara felt the steadiness of him beside her, the way you felt weather as a presence surrounding and reliable. Vivian stood up. She hadn't planned to. Clara could see that immediately, the slight wrongness in her posture, the half-second of the lawyer's hand reaching toward her as she rose. But Vivian Caldwell had never been a woman who sat still when things moved against her, and the room was moving against her family now, and she couldn't let it go unchallenged. "This meeting," she said, and her voice was controlled and precise, "is being orchestrated by a woman who has been running a deception in this town for 6 weeks. She looked at Clara. "There is no child. There has never been a child. Jackson Reed made a false claim in the street to help a woman he barely knew, and she has used that intervention to attach herself to him, and to use his reputation as a weapon against my family." She looked at the room. "You should ask yourselves who is really on trial here." The room's temperature changed. Clara felt it. The uncertainty, old familiar, the same thing she'd felt on Main Street 6 weeks ago, when 30 people had decided simultaneously to doubt her. She did not stand up immediately. She waited 1 beat. 2. Let Vivian's words hang in the air long enough for the room to feel their weight. Then she stood. "Vivian is right," she said. The room went absolutely still. Even Eleanor Marsh's expression changed. "There was no child," Clara said clearly. "Jackson made that claim to stop a crowd from destroying my reputation based on a lie that Vivian started. The claim was false. I want this room to know that plainly, because I'm not willing to let the truth of Edwin Haverford's situation be complicated by a lie that I allowed to persist for my own protection." She paused. "I was wrong to allow it. Jackson was wrong to make it, and we've talked about that between ourselves, and we'll answer for it however this town decides we should." She looked at Vivian. "But that is a different wrong from stealing 40 acres of land from a man with 3 sons using fabricated documents and a private survey. Those are not the same scale of wrong, and I will not let this room be confused into treating them as equivalent." Vivian opened her mouth. "Sit down, Vivian." It was Eleanor Marsh. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Vivian sat down. What happened next came from a part of the room Clara hadn't been watching. A man stood up near the back left wall. He was somewhere in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who worked outdoors and had come to this meeting after being outside already that morning. Clara didn't recognize him. "My name is Daniel Haverford," he said. "Edwin is my father." The room turned. Edwin Haverford at the front table turned too. And on his face was something that Clara had not expected to see: the specific devastation of a parent confronted with a child they believed was too far gone to return. His eyes filled. He didn't look away. "I live in Idaho," Daniel said. "I got a letter 3 weeks ago from a woman I didn't know telling me what she'd found in the courthouse records and what she was trying to do about it." He paused. "I rode for 4 days to be here." The room was not breathing. Clara felt Jackson's hand find hers under the table. She hadn't told him about the letter. She hadn't told anyone. She had written to both of Edwin's sons 6 days after she'd found the courthouse records because it had seemed like the right thing to do, and she hadn't wanted to announce it in case they didn't come. Daniel Haverford looked at the committee table. "My father sold that land because he was afraid," he said. "He was afraid of losing everything and leaving us with nothing. He made the best decision he could with the information he had, and that information was a lie." He paused. "I left this county because there wasn't enough work after the sale. I told myself I was leaving for opportunity. But the truth is, I was leaving because watching my father live with what had been done to him was more than I could bear. His voice was steady, but only just. I'd like to not leave again. He sat down. The room exhaled. Edwin Haverford put his face in his hands, just for a moment. Then he straightened. He was a man who didn't like to be seen breaking, and he straightened and kept his eyes forward. But his shoulders were shaking slightly, and Clara, sitting beside him, reached over and put her hand on his arm and left it there. He didn't pull away. The committee deliberated for 40 minutes. Clara, Jackson, Edwin, and Daniel waited in the anteroom, and the silence between them had the compressed, specific quality of a silence that contains everything and cannot yet say it. Daniel Haverford kept looking at his father. Edwin kept looking at the wall. Finally, after about 15 minutes, Edwin said without turning, "You rode 4 days." "Yes," Daniel said. "Your work." "I told them I had family business," Daniel said. "It's the truth." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "Your brother." "He couldn't get away this time," Daniel said. "He wanted to." Edwin turned and looked at his son for the first time since the meeting. Whatever passed between them in that look was not for anyone else in the room. Clara stood up and walked to the window and stood with her back to them, giving them the only privacy the small room offered, and Jackson followed and stood beside her, and they looked out at the street below without speaking. After a moment, Jackson said quietly, "You wrote to his sons." "Yes," Clara said. "You didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure they'd come." He was quiet for a beat. "When did you do that?" "The same night I sent the letter to Fisk," she said. "It seemed like the right thing." He looked at her. "Clara." She turned to look at him. "The right thing," he said softly, "doesn't usually occur to people at the same time they're fighting for their own survival." "It occurred to me," she said simply. He shook his head slightly. Not disagreement, something closer to wonder. Behind them, quietly, Edwin Haverford said something to his son in a low voice, and Daniel answered, and the sound of it, two people relearning the cadence of each other's presence, was one of the most private and complete sounds Clara had ever been near. She turned back to the window and let them have it. The committee's decision was not a legal ruling. Fisk had been clear about that from the beginning. The Civic Committee had no judicial authority. What they had was something different, and in a town the size of Willow Creek, arguably more powerful public record. Community standing. The specific legitimacy that came from a formal proceeding with witnesses and documentation, and Eleanor Marsh presiding. The committee's written finding stated that the documentation presented was consistent and credible, that the property transaction of 1877 showed evidence of material misrepresentation, and that the committee recommended the matter be referred to the county court for formal legal review. It also stated in the final paragraph that the committee found no basis for any negative characterization of Edwin Haverford's conduct in the original transaction. It did not address the Caldwells directly beyond the referral. It didn't need to. When Eleanor read the finding aloud in the full room, the silence that followed was not the silence of people waiting for more. It was the silence of people who had understood what they heard. Vivian Caldwell sat very still. Thomas stared at the table. The lawyer beside them was writing something rapidly on a notepad, and Edwin Haverford, sitting at the front table in his best coat with his son in the chair beside him for the first time in 2 years, let out a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. The Caldwells left before the room finished clearing. Vivian went first, and she did not look at Clara as she passed. Not from shame exactly. Vivian was not constructed for shame in the conventional sense. It was something more strategic than that. The look of a woman who is already thinking 6 moves ahead and has decided that the current position is not worth defending further. Thomas followed. He stopped briefly near Clara's chair. She waited. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "The county court will finish it, and Fisk is very good." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not anger exactly. Something more complicated, and in a strange way more honest than anything she'd seen from him before. "My father built things," he said. "Real things. Not just, he wasn't only what those documents say." Clara looked at him steadily. "I believe that," she said. And she meant it. "It doesn't change what the documents say." Thomas held her gaze for one more moment. Then he left. Clara watched him go. Jackson stepped up beside her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. She had been answering that question with more truth in it each time. "Yes, I am." The town of Willow Creek processed what it had seen with the specific thoroughness of a community that had been confronted with its own capacity for error. It took time. Real acknowledgement always did. Margaret Hines was the first. She came to the boarding house the evening after the meeting, and she didn't bring an elaborate speech or a carefully worded apology. She brought a covered dish, a pot of chicken stew, and she set it on Clara's kitchen counter and said, "I should have believed you the first morning. I knew Vivian. I knew how she operated. I chose to hedge and it wasn't right." Clara looked at her. "I know why you hedged," she said. "You had a business. You had neighbors. It costs something to stand up." "It costs more not to," Margaret said. Clara accepted that. Bess Holloway came 2 days later and was characteristically less graceful about it. She talked for 15 minutes and covered only about half the ground Margaret had covered in 3 sentences. But her intentions were genuine, and Clara received them in the spirit they were offered. 3 other women came over the following week. Geraldine Park, who had pulled her daughter inside and shut the door on that first morning, came on a Thursday afternoon, and she stood at the door with a look of such direct discomfort that Clara almost felt sorry for her. "My daughter asked about you this morning," Geraldine said. "She asked why she hadn't seen Miss Clara in a while. She said you were the nicest lady on the street." She stopped. "I didn't know what to tell her." "Tell her I'm here," Clara said. "Same as always." Geraldine pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Come in. I have coffee." Oid. The 2 boarders who had left Calloway and Abbott did not return. Clara didn't expect them to, and she found she didn't particularly need them to. 3 new boarders arrived in November, 2 of them referred by Margaret Hines's network. One of them, a schoolteacher from the next county who had heard through some chain of transmission. She couldn't fully account for that the Whitfield boarding house was clean and fair, and run by a woman worth knowing. The ledger balanced by December, not extravagantly, but honestly. And honest was what Clara had always preferred. The county court case moved at the pace of legal proceedings, which was to say slowly, deliberately, and with far more paperwork than any of them had anticipated. But it moved. Fisk made 2 trips to Willow Creek in November, each time sitting at Clara's kitchen table with Edwin and Jackson, and going through documents with the careful thoroughness that Clara had come to associate with his particular brand of competence. Collins submitted to a formal deposition in December and held to every word of his original affidavit. The fabricated engineer's reports were traced to a print shop in Butte that, under questioning, confirmed they had been commissioned by a representative of Harold Caldwell in the autumn of 1877. The Caldwell family's lawyer filed 3 countermotions between November and January. Fisk dismissed all 3 in terms that Clara, reading his written responses, found quietly satisfying. The deed amendment. The notarized lie filed 9 days before the civic meeting was challenged on the basis of the notary's documented professional relationship with the Caldwell family. The notary, when formally questioned, developed an uncertain memory regarding the specific transaction and was unable to produce the original signing record. The counter document collapsed. Edwin Haverford's case was not resolved in a single dramatic moment. It was resolved the way most real justice was resolved, in increments, through accumulated evidence in a county courthouse 60 miles from Willow Creek, in a proceeding that generated no spectators and a great deal of paper. But it was resolved. In February of 1883, The court ruled that the 1877 transaction had involved material misrepresentation and ordered compensation from the Caldwell estate. The amount was calculated based on the land's actual value at the time of sale and adjusted for the intervening years. It was not everything Edwin Haverford had lost. It could not be 5 years couldn't be compensated in dollars, and his son's scattered years couldn't be retrieved by a court order. But it was something real. It was acknowledgement in the most formal language available that what had been done to him was wrong. Edwin Haverford stood on the steps of the county courthouse with his son Daniel beside him, and he looked at the sky for a long moment without speaking, and then he turned to Clara and said, "I didn't think I'd live to see it." "I know," Clara said. "How did you know to look?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "A half sentence," she said, "and the feeling that someone was hiding something." She paused. "And a lot of sleepless nights." Edwin Haverford looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of someone who wants to say something they don't have adequate words for. "My son came home," he said finally. "That's worth more than the money." Clara nodded. It was. The wedding was in April. Clara had not wanted anything elaborate, and Jackson had not offered anything elaborate, which was one of the many ways they continued to be well suited to each other. Eleanor Marsh offered the use of her garden, and Clara said yes, because Eleanor's offer was the kind you said yes to, not from obligation, but from genuine gratitude. Margaret Hines made a cake. Bess Holloway cried loudly during the vows, and then pretended she hadn't. Edwin Haverford sat in the front row, with Daniel beside him, and the chair on Daniel's other side was occupied by a man Clara had never met, who turned out to be Edwin's other son, arrived the night before from somewhere in Oregon. His travel paid by a portion of the court settlement. His presence, the thing that made his father unable to look straight ahead for the first 5 minutes of the ceremony. Clara stood beside Jackson in Eleanor Marsh's garden in April, with the warmth of the first real spring day coming through the air, and she looked at the man she was marrying with the same honest attention she brought to everything column by column, checking for inconsistencies. She found none. She found a man who had stepped into a street on a Tuesday morning without being asked. A man who told her about his sister without flinching. A man who listened when she talked and pushed back when he disagreed, and never once in all the months since that first breakfast had tried to make her smaller than she was. The judge asked if she took this man. "Yes," she said. The same word she'd said in the sitting room in October, with the same absence of hesitation. Jackson looked at her when she said it, and what was on his face was not performance, and not relief, and not the satisfied conclusion of a man who had won something. It was simpler than any of those. It was happiness, uncomplicated and complete. He had not let himself feel that she understood for a very long time. Willow Creek by summer had changed in the small but durable ways that towns changed when something true had been brought into them. The Civic Committee adopted a formal process for reviewing property disputes. It was Eleanor Marsh's doing, and she was characteristically unapologetic about using the momentum of what had happened to build something that would outlast it. Vivian Caldwell remained in Willow Creek. She did not soften exactly. Clara hadn't expected her to, but she quieted. The specific loudness of her family's influence had been adjusted by public knowledge, and public knowledge once established was difficult to revoke. Thomas handled the family's remaining business with more visible caution than his father had, which might have been conscience or might have been strategy, and Clara found she didn't need to know which. The boarding house stayed full through the summer. Clara hired a part-time helper in July, a young woman of 19 named Ruth, recently arrived in Willow Creek, who was looking for work and had nobody in the county who knew her yet. Clara paid her fairly and taught her everything she knew about running a household as a business and as a refuge, and Ruth, who was smart and grateful and asked good questions, learned faster than Clara had expected. She reminded Clara a little of herself at 19. She hoped Ruth's path would be somewhat less eventful. Jackson came home from the ranch one evening in August to find Clara at the kitchen table with a new ledger. Not the boarding house accounts, but something different. He looked at it over her shoulder. column headings, names, dates, financial figures. "What is this?" he asked. "A list of property transactions in this county going back 15 years, she said. "Fisk sent me a methodology for identifying patterns of undervalued sales connected to prior knowledge of development plans." Jackson stood very still. "Clara." "Edwin wasn't the only one," she said. She looked up at him. "I don't know that yet for certain, but I want to find out." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "Show me where you are," he said. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the first name on the list. They worked until midnight. Outside Willow Creek settled into its summer evening, the sounds of a town going about its ordinary life, carrying, as all towns, did its histories and its secrets and its debts, both paid and unpaid. Inside, two people sat at a kitchen table and looked for the truth in columns of numbers, because that was what they did together, and because they had both learned the same thing in the hardest way possible, that a good name once stripped away by a lie could be recovered, but only by someone willing to stand up and say plainly, and without flinching, what was actually true. That justice in a small Montana town in 1883 did not arrive on horseback or announce itself with fanfare. It arrived in ledger entries and courthouse records and affidavits signed by men with troubled sleep and old regrets, and that the strongest thing one person could offer another was not protection or rescue or the shelter of a more powerful name. It was this, the willingness to stay, to look, to say we when the easy word was you, and to mean it every single time. Clara Whitfield had walked into a street alone on a Tuesday morning in October, and she had walked out of it with something she hadn't gone looking for and couldn't have anticipated and would never for the rest of her life take lightly. She had walked out with a partner, and that had made all the difference.